about technology and about the internet. And our panelists are really going to talk about both the benefits and some of the challenges of using technology. Our first speaker for this panel is Jong Song-Pei Cho, who's a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His dissertation, From Analog to Digital, Korean Gay Men and the Internet, examines the dynamics of queer risk and desire in South Korean technoculture. His publications include The Wedding Banquet Revisited, Contract Marriages Between Korean Gays and Lesbians, which won the Best Graduate Paper Award, the Society for East Asian Anthropology. And he's going to talk about recent organizing regarding anti-discrimination on the internet.
Okay, great.
So thank you very much. I'd like to thank IRN for inviting me, in particular Sally Chung. What I'd like to do with today's presentation, actually my presentation today is not based on my dissertation. It's based on a separate paper that I had written for an edited volume on Korean civil society that is coming out in 2010. Okay, but what I'd like to do is actually to start with a video from YouTube. So the title of my presentation, as you can see, is South Korea, LGBT Politics and Technology. And so what I will do is I will provide a brief overview of the, the 14 years of gay and lesbian organizing and trying to tie it to technology as a way to contextualize what you have just seen right now. So if I can move on to the next slide. So basically what you have seen, what I have shown you through that clip on YouTube is are the recent protests in South Korea against the revised anti-discrimination bill. So this bill, it was first introduced, the anti-discrimination bill, it was first introduced by Roh Moo-hyun, who was a liberal, prime minister, liberal politics. But in 2007, when it was revised, 7 items were deleted from the 20 items that were originally protected. And so among the deleted items was sexual orientation. So that's what the GLBT groups were protesting in that clip that you had just seen. So an emergency coalition of South Korean LGBT rights group was formed in November 2007. So what I will do in this presentation is basically I will focus on 2 points. First, how the technology, in particular BBS, which is the Bulletin Board Services, the precursor to the internet, was used to sort of expand the gay and lesbian movement and the community in South Korea. And secondly, how the internet has been most recently used in this protest of the emergency coalition. And through that, I want to talk about how GLBT politics in South Korea is both building upon the previous history of the pro-democracy movement, which in South Korea in the mid-1990s, in the 1970s and 80s was dictatorship, military dictatorship. Okay, so that's what I'm driving towards. All right. So to give you a brief overview of the GLBT movement in South Korea, we can pinpoint, I guess, 1994 as a transition period. So before 1994, I'm actually having a very hard time facing you guys and looking at our point. I think I'm going to get a bad night in front of this. Maybe I should sit on this side, but then I can't see you guys. All right, no, I don't see you guys. All right, so before 1994, I remember, Koreans always saying there are no homosexuals in Korea, and they were talking to me, right? So they considered homosexuality in Korea to be a foreign disease, right? Something that was decadent, that was part of the Western decadent culture. But there was gay subculture in large cities like Seoul, where there were gay saunas, gay theaters, gay parks where men cruised. With lesbians, less so. So there was this sexual subculture. So rather, as I think one of the other presenters had mentioned this morning, there was this idea that the term homosexual, when it was used, it referred to either womanly men, right, or it referred to men who dressed as women, right? And so starting in the what we would call, I guess, transvestites or transgender people. That's how gay was conceptualized up until 1994. But then, starting around 1994, especially with the waves of both democratization and globalization, you saw the emergence of the first gay and lesbian organizations. So the first one was called Chodonghae, which was started in 1994. But because of internal tensions between the lesbians and gays, where the lesbians felt that their issues of being both a woman, right, being a lesbian, being a woman, and a sexual minority were not being addressed, the group broke up within a couple months of it's been founded into 2 separate groups: Kingusai, which means between friends, which is a gay men's group, and Irikiri, which means amongst us, amongst ourselves, which is a lesbian group. And these 2 organizations still exist. And then, again, at the same time, but there was also Come Together and 1001. Come Together is a gay and lesbian group, which is part of Yonsei University, a private university. And 001 is the gay and lesbian group for SNU, Seoul National University. So these are both elite, private and public colleges in South Korea. And so with the coming out of these students, elite students, they put a face to what had previously been seen as a very, perverted behavior. And so that kind of tension is what, if you look up on the screen, I have the 2 terms, 동성 연애자 and 동성 애자. So 동성 연애자, what it means basically is, they conceptualize homosexuality as this free-flowing desire that anyone can be seduced into. So there is no subject behind that desire, right? And so what these groups were trying to do was turn this idea of perverted desire into notions of identity and community. And so that's what they were trying to do. And okay, next slide. So, along with the emergence of these gay and lesbian organizations, you also had BBS services. So, bulletin board services, I don't know if you guys know, were sort of the precursors to the internet. So there were three, Hightel, Choliad, and Nowmery. These were the server companies. And so on these BBS, the gay men and lesbians, they had these very simple text-based features that they were using. And so the importance of this new technology was that it was taken up by the marginalized groups within Korean society, which was not just sexual minorities, but youth, right? I mean, South Korea, like other East Asian countries, are Neo-Confucianist culture, where it's generation, right? So age plays a very important factor in organizing social hierarchies. So this technology was very pivotal to expanding the GLBT community and movement, which manifested itself in 1997, where gays and lesbians were increasingly visible in the public sphere. So, for example, they joined the labor strike against revision of labor and national security laws in 1997 and protesting homophobic textbooks. Next slide. So a very important event reshaping not just South Korea, but I think East Asia in general is the Asian financial crisis in 1997. So along with the Asian financial crisis, you had, of course, mass unemployment. So within, I think, a few weeks or a few months of this crisis, you had mass unemployment of, 1 million people being thrown out of work. And so in the Korean case, in the South Korean case, this was pivotal for several reasons. One of them was the neoliberal restructuring that went on. So what I mean by that is, there was a conjuncture of both the election of Kim Dae-jung, who is known as a human rights president. He was actually the Nobel Peace Prize winner, right? So he was also a former dissident, right, who had almost been killed during the military dictatorship. So he was elected at this pivotal moment when South Korea was, faced massive unemployment. And so what he did was he basically restructured South Korean society, meaning he introduced flexible labor, right? He introduced contract labor, right? South Korea right now has one of the highest rates of contractual labor, creating labor insecurity. But along with this neoliberalization of South Korea, what you also saw was what I call neo-familism. So within East Asian countries, what you have is a model of governance where the family is state, nation writ large, right? So, especially after the IMF crisis, what happened was that the notion of the family as nation was revalorized. So especially when with the mass unemployment of middle class heads of households, the rhetoric of family as a nation became really revitalized in South Korean context. And then the third important thing that came out of the IMF crisis, well, South Koreans, we say the IMF crisis, blaming the International Monetary Fund, right, for the crisis, which it was partly responsible for. And the term IMF also, during the crisis meant like, I am fired, right? So, because anyway, that's what IMF spells for Koreans right now, right? Mass unemployment. During the crisis meant like, I am fired, right? So, because anyway, that's what IMF spells for Koreans right now, right? Mass unemployment and neoliberal globalization. So another thing that was important was informatization push, drive, that was really boosted after this crisis because South Korean nation, the state realized that it could no longer depend on the late developmentalist model where the state was in charge of the entire, economy, protected national economy. And so it started engaging in this financialization of the economy, opening up the borders. So right now, like South Korea, like many other nations in the world, is caught up in these global circuits of finance, right? Making the state very powerless to provide, social welfare, right, or protection. So that's the other thing. And so as a result, South Korea is right now known as one of the most networked nations in the world. Next slide. I have 7 slides and we're done with 3. So, all right, I will try to speed it up. And another important event was the Exxon incident in Xzone was the first gay internet site in South Korea, and what it tried to do was it tried to create this notion of gay family. So the owner of Xzone was Junjun, who was like a 40-year-old guy, right, who didn't even know how to use computers. And one day he went on to BBS, and he found this other world from this, world very separate from the world of bars, right, where people just got drunk every night. And so he says being able to, chat with other men and discuss his personal problems, in a sober state was like a godsend, And so he tried to create this notion of gay family. And what he meant by gay family was where gay men could tell each other things that they couldn't tell their own families. And that they could, if one man was sick, the other man, as a brother, right, would run out and get the medicine for him, right? So that's the idea. But then in 2001, what happened was the Ministry of Information and Communication mandated the blockage of all gay and lesbian sites in South Korea. And the reason they did that was because under the youth protection law, homosexuality was defined as harmful to minors, so to speak. And that's a very interesting case that I can elaborate later. And so what happened was Xzone sued the state and won in 2003. And what that did was, in the Korean context, was it opened up the era of human rights for sexual minorities. So previously, homosexuality was seen as a perverted behavior, and later with cultural organization, it was seen as part of a cultural movement. But now it was seen as a human rights issue. And so the issue of sexual citizenship or membership to the nation state, emerged. Next slide, please. So I gave you all that as a background to talk about the anti-discrimination bill, right? The protest that I've shown in the first video. And so to once again come back to that. So the anti-discrimination bill was, the revised bill was designed to strengthen the National Rights Commission Act introduced by Kim Dae-jung, right? Whom I already stated was the human rights president. But instead of strengthening it, it ended up weakening it, right? So it was sending an implicit message to, the public, it's now okay to discriminate against gays and lesbians, right? So instead of protecting them, it was actually discriminating against them. But there was a power struggle that was going on because the Nonglihan government, which followed the Kim Dae-jung government, which was also a liberal administration and which was seen as very progressive, wanted to leave this anti-discrimination bill as its legacy, as a legacy of liberal rule. But in order to get that passed, in the National Assembly, they had to get rid of sexual orientation, which would hinder the passage of the bill, right? And the reason that this came up as an issue was because of the Christian right. So the Christian right, they were anticipating the election of Lee Myung-bak, who's the current president, who's very pro-business and who's also a Christian, right? So he had once in his campaign speech stated that he would I don't know if that's a term, he would devote Seoul, the city of Seoul, to God, right? And so the Christian right, being empowered by this kind of rhetoric, used homosexuality to politicize itself, so it became a political church, right? So you saw the disappearance of the separation of the church and religion. And so, so I point to that to talk about the current terrain, political terrain for gays and lesbians in South Korea, where you have the conjuncture of three phenomena, which is neoliberalism, right, which creates economic insecurity for everyone. And then you also have neoconservatism, right, the Christian right, using the rhetoric, right, of conservative family values. And then finally you have neo-familism. So neo-familism, once again, is a renewed valorization of nation, but updated in the current context with a low fertility rate. And so with the low fertility rate, the Korean state is very actively engaging in pro-natalist policies that once again is promoting family as nation. And so the consequence of all of those three factors is that GLBT identities are under attack. So people are finding that they have to, move back in with their families, right? So they're losing their autonomy as individuals, GLBT individuals. Okay? So, so basically, what I wanted to do was finally reference the technology that was used in the anti-discrimination bill protest. So some of them was like emergency meetings. So they used lightning meetings, Mondays. So through the internet, they advertised and they mobilized people to come to these offline meetings, right, to protest this. And another one was flash mobs, right? So they would once again use technologies to meet somewhere and, and say that we're discriminated against, right? I'm trying to hurry up. And then there's also what you call one-person protest. I'm not doing a very good job of explaining these things. So one-person protest is where, through technology, they would have one person stand and protest in front of the Blue House, which is the Korean version of the White House, right? But before, if you had one person protesting, I mean, like no one would notice, right? But through recording that and then through projecting that, right, and just circulating it on the internet, they were able to create, this idea of the individual protesting the state, right? So they're using technology to leverage, right? Okay, next slide. Okay, so having explained that, I think there are three things that, for me, I find most interesting to raise as discussion points. So one is the new terrain of sexual politics that I've talked about, where because of this conjuncture of neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and neofeminism, gays and lesbians in South Korea are losing autonomy, right, both as workers and as sexual minorities to carry out independent sexual lives. Another issue that I want to bring up is the issue of organizing, right, and mobilizing that these technologies can promote. And there, I'm trying to introduce the notion of trying to introduce the notion of the internet, not as being about information, but about feeling, right? Because I feel like the reason that people are using it is they're using it to socialize. But what does socializing mean? It means exchanging of feelings, right? And this was very apparent in the organizing that we saw against the anti-discrimination bill, because they used very eye-catching graphics, right? That produced this kind of feeling in the people who saw it, and that motivated them to come out and join these protests, right? And so I think this, thinking about the internet as a medium of feeling, I think, is important to think about new strategies of organizing and mobilizing. And then finally, the final issue that I wanted to address was the issue of visibility and invisibility. South Korea doesn't have any law against homosexuality, but still, most people say they would never come out until they die, their parents die. Why? Once again, because of their feeling. So their feeling is, I am affectively connected to my parents. I'm morally, bound to my parents, not to come out and shame them, right? And so I think a lot of the politics around GLBT organizing in South Korea and in East Asia is about family, right? And the affective ties that gays and lesbians feel towards their family, not to come out. And that creates the issue of visibility and invisibility. You cannot be out. So how do you mobilize? There are issues of, collective coming out. So where you're visible as a body, right, of queers, but you're not visible as individuals, right? So these are some of the issues I want to bring up. All right, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Serkan Gokemeli, who received his PhD in English from Purdue University. He has worked as a lecturer for the program in writing and rhetoric at Stanford, and is currently an assistant professor of English at the University of Connecticut. His research interests include literacy, computers and writing, LGBT, queer and literary studies, and global and transnational media studies. He's going to be speaking to us about some student activist work and internet work happening in Turkey.
Before I start, is this working?
Yes. It's working.
Well, before I start, I want to thank CLATS for the platform provided for this event, and I'd like to also thank Sally for inviting us to start with this. Thank you. And what I'm going to talk about today is in particular the collegiate student organization in Turkey titled Legato. Legato is the acronym for Lesbian Gay Topluluğu, which means in Turkish Lesbian and Gay Association. And this is a collegiate student group that organized through the internet in the 1990s, mainly using Yahoo networks. Legato was established to connect lesbian and gay college students and promote the establishment of lesbian and gay student clubs in Turkish colleges and universities. And in fact, this was successful. The first LGBT student club was established in the university in Istanbul in, I think, about 2008.
bring us in, please?
Sure. And I want to also provide is good?
Yeah.
I want to provide a brief background before I really talk about the student group, because there has been an ongoing, very active LGBT activism in Turkey. And the first two LGBT advocacy organizations were established in the largest cities in Turkey, Lambda Istanbul in 1993, and Kaos GL in 1994 in Ankara. By the middle of the 1990s, Kaos GL had helped college students to organize on 2 university campuses in Ankara. Despite these efforts, the Turkish LGBT movement struggled to broaden its scope to include larger populations. And the series of events that I'm talking about really takes place in a decade. So we're talking about massive change. So when I say that this population, the activist groups struggle, we have to take that in perspective, because it's a really brief time. They are trying to do a lot, and they've been very successful too. And the main reason for the struggle was that these organizations could not connect to lesbian and gay students across the nation due to the lack of channels to convey the knowledge and political position they had accumulated up until that point. So they were based in metropolitan areas, but in the rest of the country, really, there wasn't much of access to that information and knowledge that they built. In the late 1990s, with the advent of computer technologies in Turkey, a few local lesbian and gay student groups began using Yahoo groups to spread the word about forming similar groups in other Turkish universities, and organized under the name Legato. Widening the scope of the Turkish LGBT cause, this development ultimately led to the formation of a lesbian and gay student culture at universities across the nation, all linked to Yahoo mailing lists. And these lists connected them with pre-existing LGBT subcultures and with Lambda Istanbul and Kaos GL. And just to give you an idea, map of Turkey from the CIA website, and so if you take a look at it, it's really revolutionary. So we had only two at the beginning of 1990s, 2 LGBT advocacy groups in Istanbul and Ankara. But once the internet was introduced, what the students group started doing is that they were like, why don't we create Yahoo groups? And initially they created Yahoo mailing lists for about 20 universities. And then after that, and they knew in those universities there were gay and lesbian or queer students, right? But ultimately they were like, why don't we do this for all schools? Even though we don't know any specific person there, but they might do a search on a search engine and they might locate this group. And once they locate it, they can basically participate in the group and really organize some activities locally. And this is really what started happening. So what I do in my research, this is sort of an overview of the moment. What I do in my research basically is I did some interviews, and I'm also looking at the mailing list discussions that this group has. So they have individual mailing lists named after individual universities. So let's say Legato, if this were in the United States, Legato CUNY at yahoo.com. So in that way, they named the groups after the individual universities. So, but I'm really interested in how the Western discourse of gender, social constructions, the discourse of gender and sexuality are being sort of deployed in Turkey. And I'm really looking at how people who are exposed to this discourse, what do they really do with it? I mean, technology is the main conduit through which they access this discourse. But I want to understand what they do with it and how does that help change how they think about themselves. So I conducted interviews with individuals and how people who are exposed to this discourse, what do they really do with it? I mean, technology is the main conduit through which they access this discourse. But I want to understand what they do with it and how does that help change how they think about themselves. So I conducted interviews with individuals, and I'm going to present really, this is a lot more complicated actually, but in this limited time, I'm going to talk about 2 main things that relate to the use of the internet. Number 1, I'm going to talk about the coming out, because the internet is really helping people coming out. And number 2, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that actually internet presents in organizing an activist group on a collective level. So coming out, as chronicled in the West, and especially in the United States, has meant several things. I mean, initially from the 1950s on, initially it was, dropping hairpins and letting your hair down and all of that stuff. The initial meaning was sexual, but eventually, it became sort of coming out to small groups, friendship circles, and ultimately now we have the more activist version of it as a public stance, the social activism for gay rights, right? And I'm not saying that, all these stages clearly continue right now, and all of them are happening in Turkey too, right? So in my interviews, one of the things I found out, and what I'm doing is I'm basically looking at the interviews and the narratives that I construct out of these interviews as sort of coming out / news narratives. And some of the things that the factors that really emerge from this is that it's not just the internet, but also the traditional media has a lot to do with the coming out process, especially in people's ideas about gender and sexuality. For example, the mass media representations such as drag and trans performances, as well as police violence toward the trans population, transvestites in Istanbul, on primetime television news has really resonated with especially gay and lesbians in Turkey. So we were really talking about Stonewall happening on primetime news for a long time now. So I mean, the culture actually, the idea of queerness, the idea of homosexuality is not necessarily foreign to the culture, but it's read in a particular way so that gay and lesbian emergence is really difficult. And the other media influence on specifically the people that I talk to are the Western representation of gay and lesbian identities. So like some of my interviews said, the first time they actually saw a gay person was in Dawson Street, Albert, so there's something something good comes out of American TV, for sure in this case. But they were like, so they have all these negative sort of forbidding images of queerness from the Turkish television. And then when they saw the more positive, reaffirming images in the Western shows imported into Turkey, suddenly they were like, okay, so there's another way to be homosexual. I don't have to transition to well, if you're a man, you don't have to transition to becoming a woman, or if you're a woman, you don't have to transition to being a man. So, but the culture, the dominant perception in the culture is that if you are homosexual, you're trapped in the opposite gender's body, so you're supposed to be making expressions the way that the culture thinks about it, basically. So when they found out, they were like, okay, so there are different ways of being gay or lesbian or homosexual. Then they were like, okay, so the next really logical step was to go on a search engine. And when you type into a search engine, the organizations that I mentioned have their established websites, they have news feeds, they have everything. So I mean, if you're 18, you type into a search engine, you're going to find out about all the LGBT movement in Turkey and abroad, if you have access to this, of course. But so there's a massive change in terms of access to information. And then once people started finding each other and finding these groups, they started meeting their peers on college campuses, which led to LGBT film festivals, which led to leading groups, discussion groups, and eventually demonstrations. And once they actually made it up to these small groups, the next step for some of them, not all of them, was to participate in the established organizations. So now, we see people from high school to college level, student activists, and eventually they go to the established LGBTQ groups. So I mean, the legato became really this feedback sort of conduit that gets people from where they are and into the activist ideal, at least, I think, presented by the organization is that you come out and you become an activist. Of course, this doesn't happen in this way, but that's the idea presented. And with some of my interviews, this happened, but with some others, it doesn't. So the other thing that I wanted to, as I mentioned, I want to talk about is yes, the internet facilitates coming out, it facilitates organizing, but it also presents serious challenges in terms of collective sense of an activist group. So, especially three of the activists that I talked about, Zeynep, a female, Ünal, a male, and Deniz, another male, they mentioned their initial, we're talking about mid-1990s, their initial connection to LGBT groups. For instance, Zeynep mentioned that, it was mostly a male group, there wasn't any sort of space for women. So what she decided to do is they decided basically, a few of the females in the group, to start an organization, sort of a subgroup. They didn't separate from cause in Ankara, but they started a group and they called that Doors of Sappho. And in Ünal's case, he basically thought that he had some political differences with the organization because Cause initially started as a very sort of a leftist socialist group. I think it's more mainstream right now. But at the beginning, for some students, and we're talking about middle to upper class, college-educated, conservative students, that the leftist ideology and other radical political ideologies, they disagree with those. And then this person also said that the older activist groups are really not speaking to the younger population. So his move was to start an online group called Gay Ankara, exclusively male group, and he and his friends basically complete a separate form of Cause. And then finally, there is another one. And in his case, he really made effort to become part of the organization, especially along Istanbul. And eventually he did manage, but he did say that at the beginning, for instance, people would not take him seriously because either he was too young or also because of his upper class status. So he had to actually really spend a lot of time, make a lot of effort to establish himself as a member of this organization. And so we have then, in my interviews I found out that Legato actually was not the first student organization that was internet-based. We had two others. So that was Dolor Sappho, that was the Gay Ankara, and in fact the Gay Ankara actually spawned Legato because what happened is that they were the ones who came up with the idea of creating Legato. And this of course created a lot of difficulties and a lot of controversies among the activists, because what happened is that, especially among college-educated young adults that the established organizations were targeting, the internet has emerged as a major rival to face-to-face initiation and association in LGBT communities. And the main problem was that the organizations and student groups could not necessarily control their discourse. Because once they had an online group, people were scattered all over the town or all over the nation, and if they didn't get together frequently face-to-face, what ended up happening was that the conception of the organization, first of all, was very different. And they had controversy, they had conflicts about the goals. And then eventually individuals would make public announcements in different places as if they represented the organization. And this is really an important issue because, yes, homosexuality is not illegal in Turkey, has never been illegal. And the culture, again, accepts the existence of it, but resists recognizing it as a gay and lesbian public identity. So what happens is that the organizations are really careful and they don't want to be targeted for any inappropriate comment or any political controversies, because if that happens, then that's going to endanger their existence. And I want to mention this, and this issue was replicated in the emerging student groups also. And the groups basically, once they realized, once this was repeated at least 3 or 4 times, and once they realized this was happening, then they had to really think about strategically how they can use technology. And to be honest, women were really wise about this, because with the Dolor Sappho that I mentioned, one of my interviewers was actually involved with that. So she said that once they realized that people associated online formations with the group, and they started talking about the group as if they were the representative of the group, they realized that they had to make a distinction between the offline group and the online group. So they basically said, Dolor Sappho, the title, is only for people who get together for face-to-face meetings. If you don't come to the meeting, do not ever say that you're part of this group. And then they created an online group, which they called Dolors of Blizzes. And what they would do is they would basically recruit women actively through this online group. So let's say somebody contacts them and they would correspond and email back and forth with them for like 5-6 months. And once they realize the person's intentions, whether they want to be an activist, they want to be actively involved with things for the community, then they would invite them for face-to-face meetings. But that was really sort of like an initiation process in that way. And so the new social networking technologies are really, and I'm wondering, the question that I want to pose for us is that, and we're talking about really like mailing lists, bulletin boards, as John talked about, but now we have MySpace, there's Facebook. So the new social networking technologies will further affect this process, and it seems to succeed. All activists will have to consider its possibilities as well as challenges of internet-mediated queer organizing. And in Turkey, the activists have realized that, and I just want to leave you with one main thought, is that recently, for instance, they came up with it in the campaign. They were like, it's not coming out of the closet, it's coming out of the internet. And that was their campaign. Thank you.
So our last speaker for this panel, and you can take a moment now and turn off your cell phone. Whatever it is that's speaking over here. And for those of you who recently joined us, Videoratha Hassoun is still the coordinator for the Caribbean region, and does a lot of work with technology, both with the IRA and beyond the IRA.
Good afternoon again, and it's afternoon, yes. So thank you again for the opportunity to talk a little bit about technology and the potential of technology to facilitate online and real-world work and progress for sexual minorities. And I'm doing this in the context of the Caribbean, and I'm going to try and use SASA as a case study. So some context. SASA is the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, which was formed in 2003 in Guyana around the advocacy for the inclusion of sexual orientation in the Constitution as one of the clauses for non-discrimination. And this last year received this email from the United States. Very frequently we get requests for people who want for lawyers representing people in the United States, England, and Canada who want to apply for refugee status. So they ask us. So this is what was there. There's not a lot of information online, but they visited the site, they're impressed with the work that they're doing, and they want to know all of this kind of information. So this is the context in which we operate and we use the internet to provide information. Next slide. So I just want today just to present a little bit about Caribbean sexualities on the internet. And as I said, use the SASA case study and look at some of the challenges and opportunities of technology as it relates to Guyana and the Caribbean. Next. Okay. So what we have right now, most recently launched last year, is the CAISO website out of Trinidad. It's the Coalition for the Advancement for the Inclusion of Sexual Orientation. And again, that coalition emerged out of a policy discussion, the national gender policy discussion, where sexual orientation is taken out of the blog, very similar to what happened in South Korea, the political movement then. And that blog, the G-Spot blog, is very active and very visible. And it gives a lot of information on what's happening, and it also is being used to promote the activities, what people are doing in Trinidad and Tobago. It's a very different place. JFLAG, Jamaica Forum for Lesbian, Bisexual, and Gays, they have their website and the blog. And of course, SASA has the website at sasa.org.ui. I just added these other news type blogs, which was the Blog de Moi of Martinique, which is has different things from a woman in Martinique. Then there's the Freeform blog out of Trinidad, the Freeform website out of Trinidad, MSM NPA, which is, by the way, I'll upload this presentation to our IRN site, so I know these people are writing down. Just give us a day or two, because we've got to start Thursday. Actually, all of this was listed before, but we have to start up again. So by Monday, we should have all this together. The MSMNPA is an HIV initiative, and it's focused on producing a magazine and the website. And then Sunshine Cathedral out of Jamaica, they do their site. The Sunshine Cathedral is affiliated with the Metropolitan Community Churches. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that here. And then there's a GLBT Jamaica blog, which I will put a link up to on our website later, because I can't see it on this slide. Which I will put a link up to on our website later, because I can't see it on this slide. Next slide. Right. So in addition, we've also got the Curacao main platform. The SASA Film Festival is on Facebook as well. I'll talk a little bit more about the SASA Film Festival. And I wanted to shout Yahoo Groups, Yahoo Groups, Yahoo Groups. I think Yahoo Groups has done a lot for the community in places like Turkey, Guyana, the Caribbean. There was a gay Guyana Yahoo Group from way back in 1996. Just when internet was formed, and then there was a gay West Indian group. I think there was a gay Barbados and all of those sort of groups that formed up. It initially started for erotic interest, but then it moved into other kinds of discussions. So right now, the active groups, there's something called the Carry Flags Yahoo group, which has at least 20 posts a day, news and all sorts of events. Carry Flag stands for the Caribbean forum. I think it used to stand for the Caribbean Forum for Lesbians, Bisexuals, and Gays, but it stands for something else now. I can't remember because of the politics it changed its name. Or SASA has the Yahoo Group, which formed in 2003, and there are, as I said, a few others. Research-based work, there's the MAN Initiative, which is being relaunched out of Jamaica, the Caribbean Anti-Violence Project, which was just fizzled out, and then there are many HIV-related websites. Next, please. So I bring up here the screenshot of the SASA website, and just to put a little bit about history, and a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. Of course, the SASA website gives visibility as any website will do. Now, I want to talk a little bit about funders at the bottom there. The SASA website was created out of an MSM HIV project, which is funded by the World Bank and the Ministry of Health. So our SASA website has very prominently displayed the government, the code of arms, it's like I said, it's a government website, and it has a World Bank logo on it. And we're not going to remove that with just now because there's a certain irony in happening there. Right? The name and logo was created out of discussion. The name and logo for this organization was created out of discussions on the internet. The story goes, we had an email from someone who I met afterwards. He and the woman, this guy and the girl were chatting online. They didn't know each other. And they discussed and they came up with that name, Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, and they designed a logo between them on the internet. As far as I know, they never met each other in person. We don't know who that woman is. Right? So it's interesting that we were formed out of this internet. And I think SASA relies on the internet. The stories we put there, we started this thing about putting something called Testimonies from the Spectrum, which is just basically stories about the experiences of people who are in Ghana, and they're all across the spectrum, ranging from gay and proud man to the reforming homosexual, which surprised a lot of people because this is someone who was praying and participating in the church, and he talked about coming out of the homosexual lifestyle. That's all part of the spectrum that is in Guyana. There's a lot of pressure in Guyana for people, the right-wing churches here have a lot of influence. Just go back to the, just go back. And so the stories, the other content is related to that MSN content project, which we had to put up as part of the project that we did. And then, of course, we use the site for other things. Next slide now, please. Okay, so the film festival. I don't know if many, you probably don't know, but the SASA Guyana has the English-speaking Caribbean's only gay and lesbian film festival. The first one was in October 2005. So we thought that it didn't happen again. We're now entering the 6th year for it. And this film festival could not exist without the internet. And this is because we make our connections with film directors and with people, and we get our films and so on. All of this, the accountability and the visibility of the film festival is all done through the internet. And this year, we have a curator who is from Canada, Paul Lee. Some of you might know him. And we've never met this man. We're communicating on email frantically. He learned about our film festival on the internet. He knew a few people in Canada. And he's collecting the entire set of films. And most of the directors who are contributing films are doing that based on information we provided about previous film festivals. That's the importance of accountability. So that is very important for us. The film festival, who's coming to the film festival on Facebook? So you put up your Facebook events, and those we call ourselves the sodomites, who are on Facebook. We invite all our friends to this event, and it's interesting to see who is attending the event. So that's where we see our allies. They're very often attending the event on Facebook doesn't mean they're going to come see the movie. And it's been interesting who's also not attending the event. Right? So this kind of visibility it's interesting how we use Facebook for this, and that's how we continue to use Facebook, because some of the names you say, yes, they're coming, or maybe attending, or maybe attending, and that, it's interesting. The Yahoo group formed in 2003, now 180 members, which includes public servants who are there very open. A lot of media workers and academics and public servants are there. Oh, hello, I work at the Ministry of Health in the National HIV/AIDS program, and I'm here to join your Yahoo group for the discussion. We thought, yeah, right. Right. But they're media people, and we suspect they're lurkers and spies because some of our posts have appeared on blogs that we no longer guarantee confidentiality in the Yahoo group. We no longer we allow people to join using anonymous IDs, but the Yahoo group has been very visible. So generally, we also want to be a little more visible in who wants to know what we're doing, because we want to set a tone for the NGOs in Guyana as well, to show that we're accountable. And there's NGO accountability, because civil society organizing in the Caribbean and Guyana especially, it was very low-key, very, it was very secret in the past because of our political history. So now we want to say as an organization, as an NGO dealing with the troublesome issue, we want to publish our audited accounts, we want to do all of that. So we're trying to get organized to do that. And the other issue is that we want to do a little bit more, we're getting people to share their stories. And we have to find creative ways of doing that. Whether we start adding podcasts and things like that to people who want to use text. Because again, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of stereotypes which are bandied around. And I think people who don't understand that. And also coming from the Caribbean, what is the experience in the Caribbean? Next slide, please. So the challenges. Some people still join the Yahoo group looking to hook up, and there's a need for safe hookup spaces. Adam for Adam, some of you know, it's very popularly used in the Caribbean, but in Trinidad there are security concerns. At least within the community, they realize at least four or five of the most recent attacks, serious attacks emerged related to hookups made on possibly Adam for Adam. And Adam for Adam, of course, the one is, there's no way of guaranteeing that. And there's always this demand. The digital divide. In Guyana, infrastructure isn't good. And I think some of you might be familiar with the term digital divide. It talks about the divide between those who have access to internet and ICTs and those who don't. And I talk about this reinforce other divides in the community, and I put community there in inverted commas, because what exactly is this community? And we're talking about trans. There are no trans people in our Sassy Yahoo because most of the trans people are illiterate and they don't have access to the internet because of whatever's happened in life. So straight away you're already excluding, as you're trying to build community, you're excluding those who don't have access, and we have to talk about that. The bandwidth use varies, of course, across the Caribbean and here. Bandwidth is an issue in Guyana. It's not cheap. It's politicized, and so it limits what we can do with it. I mentioned that literacy divide because even amongst those who have access, the ability to read, people don't want to read, and the information, you have to find other ways of presenting information. So the level of literacy, you might see an email, but the level of understanding what is there in communication is a little problematic. But another challenge is that we've been having these rich discussions on these Yahoo groups since 2003. What are we going to do with the knowledge and the impressions we so created? I think we're losing it. As I go back to writing, I'm now writing the 2008 annual report, and as I'm going through those 2008 messages, I realize there is a fascinating set of discussions and debates happening, and there's no way. I don't know what I'll do with Yahoo groups closes and it disappears. What are we going to do with that? So you lose that, but I think it's going to be important as we talk about history and the evolution of what we're doing. Right. Sorry.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. We really had a very wide range of examples of how the internet can be used. So now again, we're going to move into the discussion section, and perhaps I'll ask the first question. Do you all know what the first and most profitable part of the internet is? It's porn, right? And so if you were to search for Korean lesbians or Jamaican lesbians, the first thing that's going to come up is not the queer group, right? The first thing that's going to come up is not some of the things that we're talking about. It's going to be things that are really around the economics of desire. And so one of the questions that I have for the panelists and for larger discussion is, how does the internet, if at all, affect people's kind of identities and identification? So if you look at a lot of stuff from the 20th century, and from what I know, African and Caribbean sexualities, people often say, I never heard the word lesbian. I never heard the word gay. That didn't make any sense to me. Well, now with the internet, people are hearing these words. They are seeing images of what it means to look like a lesbian or gay person, different kinds of terms to use. How is this affecting how people identify or disidentify in various parts of the world?
I think one of the things that started happening, I think, within Caribbean gay, when it started with the Caribbean gay, was the fetishism of black men in porn. And it was, usually a white, the images that were white images of black men in porn. I remember when I first went to the internet looking for that. That's all, and in fact, in the gay Lesbian group and those groups, that was all it was for really. So, now, I think there are other opportunities too, because it depends on, because like within the SASA, because we're moderating it now, we don't allow sexually explicit conversation. So even if we think of people hooking up, we've done polite things to say, hey, we can't guarantee that this will happen. Please don't put your son under this because we don't know who's there. So we're trying to have conversations around politics and other things related to religion and all that related to identity. Maybe we need to learn from the internet anthropologists how do we view, because it's not only this kind of identities, all the range of identities, how we look at people. So maybe we need to learn, is there a way now, and I'm interested in that personally, is it time now to research that?
That's a very difficult question. Because actually that's something I'm struggling with in my own dissertation research, which looks at, I guess, how with the three changes that I've talked about, neoliberalism, neo-feminism, and neoconservatism, in South Korea, what you do see right now is the growth. What you see is the ability of GLBT to consume in a hidden market. Right, organized, organized mainly around the internet, but not the political, not the ability to be out. Right, so it's the narrow economic freedom to consume, but not the broader political freedom to be out. And so what you see in the Asian context, as you see in South, here is the politics of homonormativity. And neoliberal economics. And so the internet, I think, has been quite pivotal to that because, within the South Korean case, it has been pushed by the state, right, to transition from a manufacturing to a knowledge-based economy. And so it has created this online infrastructure that has been taken up to create, to further commoditize, things that have not been previously commoditized. Manufacturing to a knowledge-based economy. And so it has created this online infrastructure that has been taken up to create, to further commoditize, things that have not been previously commoditized, right? And that includes bodies, right? And and affects or feelings, right? And so, in my presentation, I ended my last slide with, the notions of immaterial labor, and and affective economy, right? And so, what I mean by that immaterial labor, it's a term by some, Italian radical, leftists. So they're talking about how the internet is, how right now the knowledge society is based on, based on profiting, right, from the social interactions, right, via advertising, right? So the social interactions, what we're doing online, the social interactions, right, is an economy, right? It's a 24-hour economy, right? That's part of the immaterial economy. And so there I'm very interested in, part of my research looks at things like, hookups, right? Because once again, the contradiction is, in South Korea, you have these protests, but they're like one-time things, right? So people come out and then they don't come out. So there are issues of mobilizing, right? Using the internet as mobilizing these smart moms, right? Who are network individuals, right? But in fact, usually at these meetings, which are usually also lesbian identified, gay men have kind of retreated from politics in South Korea. I mean, in the mid-1990s, what I showed you were many of these organizations were found by, once again, gay men, right, who came out of that socialist tradition, right? That was part of the pro-democracy movement. But then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, right, the integration of the world into this neoliberal global economy, right, gay men have retreated, and they have retreated into the internet, right, and where they are engaging in hookups. And so one of my projects is theorizing these hookups, right, in a way that it's not just a hookup, right? It's not just gay men getting off, right? Because I think it is part of the gay men kind of engaging in these kind of affective exchanges, right? And thinking of their bodies in new ways as property, right? And engaging in these contractual relations with other gay men. I do these things for you, you do these things for me. And it's part of this affective economy, I think, that arises at a moment of crisis of reproduction, right? And I think that, I mean, when people talk about neoliberalism, they always talk about, production, how production has changed into flexible, accumulation, right? So you have multinational companies with their factories in China, and then you have their headquarters in New York, and they're all being assembled. And I think what's happening is with neoliberalization, with the commodification of many things that were previously not commodified, what we also see is a crisis of reproduction. Reproduction meaning the family, right? Engaging in these non-commercialized transactions, right? That enabled the production, side to exist. I don't know if that makes sense. And you see that in South Korea, especially with the falling fertility rate, right? And people not wanting to get married because it's too expensive to raise the kids, right? And people no longer wanting to engage in relationships because it takes too much work, right? And so there is this crisis of reproduction, and along with that crisis of reproduction is you get a crisis of emotions, right? People, they don't have any emotional reservoirs, right? There are no people who are willing to sacrifice for other people, and that's the context where you see this turn towards, hookups, right? And commercialized transactions, sexualized transactions. And I think that's something that we really need to, address seriously, rather than seeing them as just, gay men wanting to get off.
Well, I agree with the previous statements. I want to point out a couple of things in the church context. I think one of the things that I want to mention, I mean, my approach to the topic is really in terms of like the issues of literacy and how someone can participate in active discourse. But I think one of the things that's happening with the internet, this made me actually, the question made me think about the current sort of ideal of citizenship in Turkey. We're talking about English speaking, Turkey's bid for the European Union, so English speaking, computer literate, educated, and so on and so forth. So the government is really pushing the internet and computer literacy and so on and so forth. But I think what's happening, as we discovered in all of these conversations, is that the internet, it brings also some of the ideologies that we are not very fond of, right? Consumption and the pleasure economy. I mean, if you think about the mainstream gay culture, for instance, in the US also, homonormativity, there's a certain way of being gay is being promoted all the time. And that's definitely linked to issues of class and race too. And speaking of race, I came to the United States about 10 years ago, but I go every year, to visit my family. But most recently, one of the things that really struck me when I went back was that now there's a talk of white Turks versus black Turks in Turkey, which makes no sense to me. And that has partially to do with the skin color. When people ask me what skin color, whether I'm white or not, I'd like to say I'm brown. But the thing is, the issue of race, I think, again, that has to do with the global sort of patterns of economic consumption. So the white Turks really refers to people regardless of your actual skin color, people who are upper class, probably top 10% of the population, which really gets most of the income in terms of in the Turkish economy. And then so that there's really the issues of race also, I think, gets mapped out now onto people that maybe that did not exist or that wasn't very visible in the past. And I think that has to do with also Turkey is becoming more and more integrated, getting integrated into the global economy. So it's not only the pleasure economy, but the racial economy at the same time.
Actually, it's interesting. I was going to ask you about class, so I'm glad that you raised it, and particularly legally you raised this in terms of literacy issues. But John and Stefan, you talked about how there's these sort of internet communities that are university based, and then internet communities, queer communities that are not, that may have people who are in universities attached to them, but that's not where they come from. And the fact it was really interesting that the kind of subgroup is university, even if those people don't necessarily attend the university. And I'm wondering if there's been, certainly classes in terms of internet access, and I think, regionally it's in someone like South Korea that's heavily networked and computerized and depends upon the knowledge economy. Even working class people are working in the knowledge economy, which is not necessarily true, let's say, someone like Guyana, right? Or someone like Turkey, places that are very rural, or have large rural populations. But and certainly in the US, there's been this sort of inside and outside academia conflict, or at least there's a narrative of that conflict, whether it's real or not. There's a story of that conflict of sort of, there's those queer academics, and then there's the activists, right? And are you finding in your own research that those divides are happening as well, or not so much?
I think what's happening is that I think the student group, because they sort of travel back and forth between the university and the established groups, I feel like they are sort of kind of like an activist/academic go-between. So I think it's helping establishing some bridges, but like you mentioned, there are definite class differences. So like for example, Lambda Istanbul, the LGBT organization in Istanbul, there is a very visible, very active trans population there. And I think so if you look at the academy and the educated people versus the trans population, who basically, not to generalize, but to survive, some of them have to survive, engage in sex work, because that's the only way, because visibly they are so different that they will not be given regular jobs. Unfortunately, they cannot, get integrated in the economy in ways that other people can pass, basically. So I think there is some connection, and some of these student groups actually, at least people who go to the established groups, they are sponsoring conferences together. I think Turkish academics are really kind of responsive. As Rustam mentioned, now the Judy Fakulty is going there. There's going to be an active academics forum. So I think there are bridges, but the problems, the conflicts are still there because people come from class-wise and background-wise from very different places. And I think personality also play a big role. So sometimes they can bridge those differences, but there are many instances they can't do that. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag.
I think that's a really excellent question. But first of all, in the South Korean case, the activists that I talked about, who were initially instrumental in kickstarting the westernized, gay and lesbian movement, the elite college students, right, who were carrying on that legacy of the pro-democracy movement, right, as spokesmen for the people, that, was the traditional, position allotted to, college students, right? They're no longer, as you were saying, in control of the discourse, right? Because, in Korea, as in US, with the internet, what you have seen is the consolidation, right, of the community, the centralization, right, of the community into a market. Just as you have seen in the US with gay.com, right? Which is where, ordinary gay men, they bypass these traditional, organizations, right, activist organizations, right, to directly interact with each other as individuals, right? And so that's where I feel like, we need to look at what's happening online, how these gay men are interacting with each other, and creating new forms of groups, right? And based on my own research, what I would venture to say is that what's happening is you see a reorganization of the traditional hierarchies, right? Within the community, within the gay culture, where there are new, it's no longer, so gay men are forming into consumption groups, right? Based mainly around the body, right? So here we use the term class, right? And the term class often is indexed to like your social position, you know, the amount of money that you make, right? And, you know, what you consume, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like I think those kind of notions of class need to be expanded, you know, challenged and expanded to include the kind of, I think, values, right, that circulate within the gay culture as a particular consumer group. And what I mean by that is, for instance, among gay men that, you know, in Korea, they're not necessarily concerned about, you know, their partner's educational level, right? Which in, you know, very education-driven South Korean context is the main indicator of your class, right? If you graduate from Yonsei or SMU, I mean, traditionally that meant that you will become the elite, right? That was the path, right? But when these men interact with each other, they don't care about the educational level of their partner because they can't benefit from it, right? Because, I mean, gay society is organized in a way that there is no institution of merit, right? So having a partner who is, you know, highly educated doesn't mean that they will benefit, right? So, I mean, as one gay man said, but what I am concerned about is they have an excellent body, right? Because then I can, you know, temporarily have access to that body and get pleasure from it, right? And I'm concerned that they have a lot of money, because then I can also benefit directly from them spending their money on me, right? And so this is what I mean, like new forms of capital, right, that are circulating in the gay community that is very important, like bodily capital. And this is how gay men invest in themselves, right? They invest in the gym, going to the gym, right? Getting that gym body, right? That allows them not only to engage in these hookups, but also to become, you know, recognized as a person in the gay culture, right? If they're too old and if they don't have a body, then they're shut out of not just these sexual hookups, but out of the social relations of gay culture. They become invisible, right? And so I think these kind of contradictions, right, is something that we need to you know, examine more carefully.
What I forgot to say is that the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, it started as Students Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, because there were a group of students who were doing university papers around the time of 2003. When those students graduated, the name changed to society. So there's this link with the university students. The other issue for us, and something we don't talk about is how SASA, the organizations, perceive this sort of upwardly mobile intellect. And we were actually described as that in the media. These are people who were university graduates, and Kenita will know some of the characters involved. And there's some of the people who want to join SASA because it's, you know, it's that kind of brand. Right? And there's another organization called GAIBO, which has a more it was organized in the older time by a man who died, and then I think they lost the ability to retain because they couldn't stay in contact, and migration also affected what happened with GAIBO. And I think in presenting SASA, I should have presented GAIBO as well as an organization, and I don't want to do that as an afterthought. There are some tensions between the members of GAIBO and the members of SASA because of this perceived class. There's nothing, I mean, I don't think that the activists are outside of academia because you've come from there, and that's what we have, which I feel positive.
I just want to make one observation here. I think there might be not two levels or two dimensions to the activism of academia that I haven't really heard that is being addressed by technology, which is the sharing of information and socialization. Because in a lot of internet groups, I would speak of a lot of black gay men groups that exist online, for example. There are a number of people who go on those groups to post stories, fictionalized stories. And case in point is that if you started reading some of those stories from way back when Yahoo books first started, Black Gay Men, you will see a lot of the sex that we talked about was unprotected sex, it was rough sex, it was sex in parks and that kind of stuff. And you notice the evolution in erotic writing take on a tone of now more protective sex, and now being more aware of STDs, and now getting tested, and so it has assumed a kind of informational tool. What you also find is that there are other groups on the internet that push and promote information about medications, about sexual transmission, about safe-sex practices, and that kind of stuff. And those are other dimensions that are outside the traditional activist or the academic, but they're also part of the entire big maelstrom of the gay social culture. And interestingly enough, like you said about SASA, I mean, a lot of groups have emerged, come out of the eroticism, come out of the homoerotic nature, and have now recognized that they have, through the internet, establishing a strong identity, a strong presence, a strong force, and they have a voice, and they're beginning to make that a change. Now, how that bridges in terms of a digital divide is an interesting conundrum, because not just the haves and the have-nots in terms of digitalization, but gender, age, availability, all of those issues play into that digital divide.
I was just wondering if there's, because we're talking about divides, if there's an age component as well. Here, thinking like my research with women in Mexico City, and I'm interviewing women between 20 and 60 years old, more or less. And there's definitely a strong difference, kind of like younger generation, yes, they have access to the internet, and then when I ask people over 40 something, their responses are like, I don't know anything about the internet. Even if they use computers for work or whatever, like it's not really part of their everyday activities. So has been this strong divide. So I was wondering if there's an age component.
Definitely there's an age. In fact, in Ghana, there's something interesting. There's an age component even in the physical presence of older LGBT people in like coming to the film festival, or coming to the parties, or anything like that. I mean, you would think that they would know that it's only people who were born after 1970, and that has to be asked as well, because there's some of the older people who venture into the movement, so they find that it's, and I think it's also this perception of this is how things were for them. It was hidden, and the visibility intimidates and scares. But they have their own ways of meeting, which is why one of the things that I'm doing, hope to do through the IR Video World History Project, is to go and tap into some of that and pull those stories out. And I'm now getting access to those groups. I know who the men are, and I think they know who I am. But to start to ask this, it's very difficult. I'm doing this through a woman friend of theirs, who is a woman with a disability, who was adopted by some of these guys, and I'm trying, one of the guys owns an internet cafe, and he's about 65 going on 70, and I can't get to meet him. He doesn't want to meet me. So it's interesting. But it doesn't happen. You just have to find out what age the guy is, what level of concern.
I think there is definitely age divide. So right now, because of internet access, I think how much it is available to the general population in Turkey, I think it's probably around like 10 or 15% of the population. It's really not that available. But to compensate for that, we do have internet cafes. But if you go to, let's say, in metropolitan areas, I'm sure it's different, but if you go to an internet cafe in a smaller town, then you realize that people who use the computers in that place will be mostly teenage boys. So what happens is that so the internet cafe has replaced the game arcades, that's one thing. But then they also became like traditional coffee houses. I mean, Turkey from the Ottoman times, there is coffee houses, and being a Muslim culture, separation of space, public space for genders. So there's a gender divide also too. That single women, especially young women, or young or old, you will not see women go into an internet cafe because it's just socially, I don't think it's considered appropriate. Again, metropolitan places I think more flexible, but in smaller places, it will be mostly male and it will be mostly teenage boys playing games.
So I think the issue of age is very interesting once again in the Asian context, because once again the societies are hierarchically organized in terms of age, right? But rather than sort of fetishize that age, right, generation within the Asian context, I think it's also important to point out the institutionalization, right? Like for example, when I talk about exomes, right? I mean, one of the fallouts from that decision where the state was trying to mandate the censorship, right, of all gay sites as adult sites. So what had happened was Exxon refused to do that, right? So it sued the state and it won, but still it ended up disappearing. Why? Because while it was doing that, another site, Iban City, which was at the time the second most popular site, agreed to the state mandate. So it became an adult site, right? So it accepted the state's ruling that homosexuality was obscene and harmful to youth, and so it reclassified itself as an adult site. And so what that meant was, because of that ruling, there was a generational divide, right? Not a digital divide, but a generational divide that was driven into the gay community. So within Iban City, which is the most popular gay portal, you will not see any youth. They cannot have access to that site. So there has been this generational divide where there is no communication between the generations. I mean, you already have that, within the offline, community, the generational divide, but that became institutionalized in the internet, in the online context. And so there is no communication between the generations. There is no circulation, sharing of knowledge, right, between the generations. And so they have a certain kind of, I think, like exploitative relationship, right, where young men view older men, right, as a potential source of income, right? So, as sugar daddies. So I think this kind of generational politics is playing out in South Korea. And I guess briefly, I just wanted to address your remark. About how, the sex, right, often becomes the basis of community. Historically, that I think was the case in the U.S. And that's where, within a lot of the gay literature, public sex is, very much fetishized as the basis for the gay community, right, in the U.S. context. But in the South Korean context, that is not the case, because the kind of sex that goes on is completely anonymous. Because those traditional ideas of virginity, right, of purity, are being applied by men to other men, right, without being challenged, they do one-time things. So they hook up with someone, and then because they have hooked up with this guy's not a potential, boyfriend material, right? And so it reproduces that heteronormative ideals, right, of virginity that traditionally apply to women. And so what has happened is you have all these hookups, you literally consume men as sex, right, and then you discard them. And so that's what I think the kind of politics that we're seeing in neoliberal South Korea, right, where we're seeing this great big cyber closet where people feel like they don't need to come offline, but then they feel so emotionally deprived within that sphere because it's all about sexual exchanges, where feelings are shut down. Right? So anyway, that's where I think that kind of public sex literature, right, that has been idealized has to be sort of like challenged in our context.
This is an interesting place for us to kind of have a pause in terms of thinking about access and thinking about people who have access to private computers in this country, right, or computers and internet access at their work, versus internet cafes. And in some parts of the world, internet cafes are open and public. In some places, the internet cafes, you can go into a booth, and so it's a little bit more private, versus having kind of the smartphone, right, or the kind of access that you can have there. So I want to thank again all of the panelists